I am a now retired surface analyst, come surface scientist. I started off as a physicist. So I did a degree in physics with maths at Reading University. Started a PhD which never finished, went into industry. Then I went to work at the University of Nottingham and spent a long time working, running an XPS instrument, which is a surface instrument there. And eventually I did a PhD, but I was 47 when I finished that. So it was kind of a long one.
So what was your favourite bit of research during this time?
So it was kind of my pet project that ended up being my PhD, which was working with ionic liquids. So there's slightly weird material. It's sort of a polymer, but it's actually ionic in that there are two parts to it that sort of interact but don't bond. So you end up with a liquid at room temperature made up of parts, and it's got some weird properties like really low vapor pressure, meaning you can put it in an XPS with a vacuum and study it whilst it's still in a liquid state. So it was kind of novel at the time. I think it must have been 15, 16 years ago when I did the first experiment. And we kind of beat the Germans to the first paper on that. So it was a bit of a result. I didn't realise what we were doing. It was quite so novel, but so we get quite a lot of citations on the first paper we did on that.
Good. And so you said that's what you ended up doing your PhD in. Did it reignite something in you that made you want to go back, or how did that happen?
It just meant I could, so because it was quite novel, I could ask lots of questions and look at it in different. So everything I do, my PhD working title was everything, as long as it's anything, as long as it's XPS, basically, not everything. That was the main instrument I could work on. I could do sample prep, but I didn't really have access at the time to other instruments other than some basic microscopy. So I really focused in on using the XPS instrument that we had and trying different things, different experiments, heating, cooling. So it was quite a nice one. So we could do lots of different experiments with it and get the fundamental properties of these ionic liquids. And there's quite a lot in my thesis that hasn't even got to publication yet. So that's 10 years old. So it's like, there's still stuff we could tell people.
And so you mentioned you've been in industry as well during your career. Do you think there's a difference in attitudes and acceptability towards gender balance between the two of them?
Right. Possibly. The issue is I've spent a very long time in academia. It's been 20 years since I was in industry. But my experience of industry was very good.
Okay.
So I was technically a technician there because I hadn't finished my PhD. So it was a little bit sort of sat underneath the radar as far as science was concerned. But I got to learn how to use electron microscopes. And then somebody said, we've got an XPS, which I just touched on that first PhD I never finished. Do you know how to do it? And I'm like, I don't know. So that's how I sort of got to play with the XPS. In terms of gender balance, I would say there was no bias in terms of your gender as to what you were allowed and not allowed to do. There wasn't any overtly bad behaviour that I noticed. It really was down to single personalities managers, maybe. Well, there was a little bit of like poor management. So I've been a carer. I have an older son, and a female manager actually was sort of being very inflexible about the time. We worked flexi time, which is fantastic. Yeah. But there was 1 month where we really struggled at school, and I didn't fulfil my whole flexi time thing. And I went to her and I said, "I'm really sorry, I've messed up." And she hadn't got kids, so she didn't realise there was nothing I could do about this thing. So that was the one time when it was really inflexible and a bit weird. And the same has happened in academia. Most of the time it's fine. Yeah. And then you get one manager, male or female, who might not have children or caring responsibilities, and they don't necessarily recognise that it's hard to juggle, balance these things. Yeah. But conversely, a very good management from other people. So your rights in both situations seem really good. So I shouldn't complain.
It's not complaining at all. It's not complaining. It sounds like, from your experience, that it's dependent on the person who manages you, and that sounds quite.
Yes. So you get this like localized cell of either stress or total relief because you've got somebody who's understanding where you're at.
Yeah, which can be very good or very bad, but it's almost daunting to think that it could come down to just one person.
Yes. So I'd thought about this because you sent me the questions in advance. I thought about what would happen if I went back again, which is I would just be more badass about my rights. Yeah. I would be saying, I can't change this. This is how it is. You have to let me do this, be flexible, work some time at home. Because at one point I was refused to do any administration work at home. This is only about 5 years ago, but prior to COVID. And I was told there is no admin in your job. You have to be in the lab. And I was, what? So it was like black is white from somebody who didn't get it. Anyway, I would have, looking back, I would just stand up and go, you're wrong, and be really blunt about it. So, it's down to personality a little bit.
Yeah. So, obviously, with hindsight, you're saying you kind of, if you were to go back and do it again, you'd stand up for yourself a little more. What do you think stopped you at that time? Oh,
probably just the sort of way females were taught. I'm quite old, I'm 55. And I was brought up in the 70s and early 80s, and we were definitely taught to keep it quiet, not complain. And if you're going to fit in, you've got to fit in by the sort of male role models. So again, it's not sort of pointing any finger of blame. Society was different.
Yeah.
And I think ladies in their 20s and 30s now are actually much more able to just speak and say what they need rather than the way I was brought up, which was very much more don't complain, don't ripple the waters.
Yeah. So we talked a bit about the kind of attitudes, and then I think in some of the other interviews we touched on gender balance and how things change when you have other women in the workplace. And you mentioned perhaps if some people had had caring responsibilities themselves, maybe they would have been more flexible.
Yes.
Do you think that there's something to be said for almost a cultural shift in who comes in and who is managing?
Yeah, I mean, in an absolute direct example of what you described there, I'd had one female manager who, so this is the university, so academia, was very inflexible for quite some time. Then she had a baby and she was working from home and doing other things. And suddenly flexibility appeared. And she realised, and the problem is imparting that this is how it is to people who haven't got caring responsibility.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily something you can just batter into people's heads.
Exactly.
Or send them on a 3-hour training course to get. It's a bit of empathy and understanding. Because at the root of it, I wanted to do science and stay in science, and I was very, very honest about what hours I could do and not do, and that didn't quite, it wasn't acceptable at the time, and that really upset me.
And do you feel, maybe looking back, that that's changed the trajectory of your career?
Totally. I ended up taking a 3-year career break and then not going back. So I've been not working for 4 years and caring. But I've got 2 kids. One is autistic. At the end of it, there was a massive sense of relief that I wasn't having to deal with stuff in academia anymore.
Yeah. No, I can imagine it being a huge source of stress and having to be responsible for children and care for them, and then getting that must be frustrating, that inflexibility.
So on the one side, there's a written policy that says you can have up to 3 years career break, sort of written in HR, which was fine. And there was talk of a flexible return, but even that didn't quite work. So this interview is turning really into sort of the negative sides of what happened, and it wasn't all negative. The end of my career felt negative, but now it's wonderful because I'm really happy. So it was just disappointing at the time.
Yeah.
So
And so if you were starting your career over today, do you think you'd have maybe a preference that you'd choose between academia or industry?
It's a hard call, actually. So academia's probably less well paid in reality. But both have really good things. So in terms of, I'm going to spin the positives on both sides. You get, particularly in academia, you get to interact with really interesting people, and you usually get to play with lots of different samples. If I was running an XPS, and I would interact with research groups from about 6 different departments at the university and outside people as well. So you get lovely little insights into all of their projects, which was fantastic. Whereas in industry, the opposite was true. I was working for an aluminium company, and I just did aluminium samples all day, most days. So I'd never seen a spectrum from, I don't know, a cerium catalyst or something like that before. So it was a complete eye-opener when I went to the university and started running polymers and, whoa, look at this, what's going on? So, there's a better pay, but not necessarily quite such a broad range of things going on in industry. They both suffer with the problem that if you want to go up in sort of get promoted, financially rewarded more, you have to step away from the lab. So I was talking to Wendy Flavel earlier, just as we sat down for lunch, and she ended up moving out of the lab and going and doing lots of management and not being very happy ultimately about the level of that sort of coming in. I absolutely adamantly refused to leave the lab, so I didn't get promoted. I spent the whole 20 odd years working for Nottingham on a postdoc salary and never got promoted or moved. It just, which was really frustrating because I was learning things the whole time. I did a PhD, I got quite expert at what I did. So sometimes that's both industry and academia does the same thing. You end up, if you want to go up in money world, you have to go and do some management or lots of management. So it swings and roundabouts a little bit.
And if you had your time again, would it still be surface science?
Probably.
Why?
It's really interesting. Trying to think, there's a quote by an Italian chap, and I can't remember his name. It's like, in order to understand matter, you have to understand first the surface, but the surface of things is endless. So I've probably misquoted that, but the point is, like, everything interacts on the outside of stuff. So if something's a catalyst, it's the outside of that catalyst lump that's doing the interacting. Air molecules, things in blood cells, everything is all surfaces.